Well, today I'd like to welcome Perry Link, who is a professor at University of California, Riverside campus, and is one of the leading China scholars in the world. Studied an amazing range of things. Before we started the interview, I just stopped into my study, and these just immediately at hand were a ton of books that he's written, and he's a true interdisciplinary scholar. He does it all, and it's terrific to have him on today when we talk about connectivity, past and present. So we're at the 31st anniversary of June 4, 1989. 31st anniversary. Now, this is called different things. Some people call it June 4th massacre. Some people call it the Tiananmen incident. So people have heard these terms, but I just want to put the question out there to you, what this was, what it was all about. I know you've studied it, you've done research on this, and you've written about it, but you were there. You were actually in Beijing on June 4th, 1989. And so from all of these perspectives, I wish you would say a few words about what happened on June 4th, 1989, and why did it happen?
Yes, I was there and was there for a few months before it happened. It was a tremendous outpouring of feeling and protest and emotion, not only among students, but among many in the city. The 1980s in China, with the opening and reform, had led to the ability to do private enterprise, and corruption came in very quickly, especially a big, ugly kind that was called guandao, where people with political power would use their political connections in order to take resources from the state system and make huge private profits from it. This was, in my view, the main complaint that was running through the city among the students and the populace. For the students, in addition, there was this sense that here we are at the end of an ebullient decade, and we have dreams for our future, and we're the first generation in a long time to be able to go to college in a normal way. And then we get assigned our jobs by political authorities in our universities, and we're just not free to go exercise what we've learned. So those two complaints were really fueling what the students had in mind. But up until the crucial moment of the massacre, they were picture perfect in their discipline. They had their own monitors who would make sure that the marches were in line and they followed set paths and so on. But then near the end of May, the word of what was going on spread to other cities, and students came from outside of Beijing, from Shanghai, from Nanjing, from Chengdu, many places. So the numbers swelled, and they swelled as well because the populace of Beijing was very much behind the students. So I think it was May 17th, there was a peak of an estimated 1 million people in or around Tiananmen Square. This effusion of protest was the first time, and I would argue the only time in the history of the People's Republic, that the regime really felt threatened. They saw an existential risk here. The top leaders, Deng Xiaoping, primary among them, had emergency meetings about what to do, and they decided to crack down. And I argue, not everyone agrees with this, but I argue that the decision to use lethal force was intentional. 11 years earlier, there'd been a big demonstration in Tiananmen Square that was put down with billy clubs. And in the putting down, no one was killed. They could have used billy clubs in 1989, or water hoses, or tear gas, or a combination of them, but didn't. Deng Xiaoping was later quoted, I think reliably, to say, "I'm willing to trade 200 lives for 20 years of peace." Whether he actually said it in exactly those words, I don't know. But the strategy that he and the other top leaders used was that we will use tanks and machine guns, and we will let it be filmed. They could have tried to do this more quietly so that the rest of China, and there were demonstrations, not just in Beijing, but about 35 other major cities. Most of the provincial capitals had sympathetic demonstrations. So the use of lethal force conspicuously was like slapping the table hard. You guys everywhere shut up. And it worked all across China. Not only did it work in terms of space, it worked in terms of time. It wasn't just 20 years, but here we are 31 years later. And I would argue that at an underpinning level of Chinese popular thinking, there is a fear of a massacre. You can do things, you can do protests, and there are a lot of protests in China among people who are dissatisfied with this or that, who do roadblocks and sit downs and things like that, but no one can really even conceive doing another 1 million person outpouring. And that's because of the legacy of fear, to put it bluntly, that was induced by this deliberately violent massacre.
That's the other question I wanted to get into. You've said that similar type things were going on in multiple cities at about the same time, and that the response in more than one place was violent. And this is what we call June 4, 1989, but there's a long run up to it. But I'm interested in the aftermath. I'm interested in let's call it the legacies of June 4, 1989. And I'm an historian. You do a lot of historical work. Our business is to remember. And why do we remember certain things? Why do we not remember certain things? And this is about legacies. Do things like June 4th have ongoing meaning?
Yes.
Or meanings? And if so, what are those meanings as we move from 5 to 10 to 15, 20, 25, 30, now 31 years? The issue becomes, in your opinion, is June 4, 1989 remembered today? And if it is remembered, who's doing the remembering and why are they doing the remembering?
Yeah. You've asked, in my mind, Paul, two different, very good related questions. One is how June 4th was a turning point for the whole society. And the other is how do different parties remember it now? I want to address them in turn. In the Mao era, to make it to perhaps overgeneralize, people didn't have freedoms in any respect. Economically, politically, religion, all of these things were bottled up. You could only say politically correct things. In the 1980s, it became possible to think of being free in these various aspects of life. When June 4th came, it made a sharp distinction between political and ideational, religious, that kind of avenue is now closed. You can't do that. What you can do is make money. That was the green light. Go get rich and be glorious. Also, it was fine to suddenly be much more nationalistic. So from the mid-90s until now, those two avenues of Chinese people expressing their aspirations have been the dominant ones, money-making and nationalism. But things like, do we want a different kind of society? What kind of political thought? What kind of unapproved religious thought? All of those are bottled up. So I think as a turning point in history, that was the main effect that the June 4th massacre had. For your second question about who remembers now, of course, the government has been eager to obliterate memory of the ugly parts of it. The inculcation of fear by the massacre was intentional and that was wanted. But to remember what happened and how painful it was and who the perpetrators were, the government wants to obliterate that. So young people under 30 years old, many don't know, or if they do know, it's a very superficial and distorted kind of interpretation of what happened. For ones that are older than 40 or 50, let's say, who are old enough to have lived through the time, who remembers is a very interesting question to me. Clearly the victims do. There's a group called the Tiananmen Mothers that organizes people who lost someone in the massacre, and they remember and support each other in remembering. But I like to think of, what did the soldiers who did the killing remember? They were brought to the outskirts of Beijing and indoctrinated in the idea that you're going to go into the city and put down a counter-revolutionary rebellion. These are young farmers who didn't understand the context at all. They go in with their machine guns, they do this killing. Eventually, they probably understood, oh, it wasn't a counter-revolutionary rebellion. What did I do? I would be very interested if someday we could study what the soldiers thought and how they remember. How the government remembers is very interesting. They don't want to spread the word. They don't want to maintain memory in the populace, but do they themselves remember? You bet. They remember. And this is obvious in that every time the anniversary comes around, including right now, suddenly there are preventive measures all over the country, including going to Tiananmen Square. There are plainclothes police at the border of Tiananmen Square now, and there will be for the next 10 days or so, preventing people from coming in unless it's clear who they are and how they're going to be watched and followed.
My last question is, and this is about legacies, and this is about remembering, and I think you've touched on some very important ways and unexpected ways in which people, even leaders, they remember. They remember. Otherwise, why have such a pronounced drive to instill forgetting if the remembering isn't part of that whole process? Anyway, my final question is, here we are at 31st anniversary of June 4th, 1989. And I'm watching the news every day coming out of Hong Kong. Newspaper coverage, television coverage, and so forth. And I have students and others who are from Hong Kong. I'm getting messages from them all the time. Do you see any connections at all? I mean, again, I'm not asking you to get into the minds of the young people in Hong Kong today who are demonstrating and so forth. But in your mind, is there some sort of legacy here at play in terms of a protest movement that takes certain forms, certain shapes, that focuses on certain issues? Let's put it this way, do we better understand Hong Kong today and what's going on there if we have a better understanding of what happened 31 years ago on June 4th, 1989, not only in Beijing, but elsewhere in China?
Right. There certainly is a strong legacy of the June 4th massacre in Hong Kong at several levels. I was there during the massacre and 5 days later left, and I went to Hong Kong and was struck that over and over and over on the Hong Kong television and in the public sphere, the massacre was the only thing people were talking about or showing on television. And Hong Kong, ever since then, has been the #1 city in the world for remembering the massacre on June 4th. They have a big public park called Victoria Park, where every year since 1989, there's been a candlelight vigil that attracts hundreds of thousands, 1 million people, much more than any other city in the world. So for many, many years, Hong Kong was the ace in remembering what happened. But in recent years, it's become much more personal for Hong Kong people. In fact, in recent years, I've heard young people say, we don't want to go to the candlelight celebration. We don't want to remember what happened in Beijing that much, because right now here, our problem is more important and it's right in front of us. So in that sense, how Hong Kong, especially young people now, are worried about their future. Can we have a future when this monolithic kind of one country, one system autocracy is bearing down on us? They don't have the leisure anymore to be idealistic rememberers of somebody else's suffering. They're facing it themselves. Does that mean, though, that they've forgotten the June 4th massacre? No. At a underlying level, psychologically, I would argue that the very reason why they're so afraid of what might be happening to their city now is that they know that baseline of what happens if you go too far, and you can be physically attacked.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This has been very enlightening. And the whole theme, of course, of our series is the connectivity between past and present. Things are happening today, but we can locate them in a much broader context of things that have been going on throughout the history of China. And I want to thank Perry Link, a professor at UC Riverside, for sharing his views with us on this very, very special occasion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.